to a crisis. So I'm going to go over a little bit of an introduction to the background on Crisis Management 3.0 and the idea of what it means to have such an increase in power in social networking at this time in terms of governance in these times of transition, in time of extreme change. So that's what the session is about today, and we're going to hit several elements of it. We've got great speakers. Dave Kaufman, for example, Director of Policy and Analysis at FEMA, has been doing some of the best work. Do you have, by chance, your report that we can wave to people and let them? There are two reports that are in the U.S. resilience system that you can pick up that are worth taking a deeper look at. One is the Crisis Response and Disaster Resilience 2030, Forging Strategic Action in the Age of Uncertainty. And this is the progress report highlighting the 2010-2011 insights from the Strategic Foresight Initiative. Really good document. In some ways, some of the most insightful, forward-thinking efforts in the government at this point. In addition, the second one, a whole community approach to emergency management, principles, themes, and pathways for action. Again, looking at how do we engage whole society, not just government response. So Dave can give us a view of how the government is leaning forward. Whole society, not just government response. Now, with that background, Dave Alberts has been working for maybe 20, 30 years now, thinking about how do we enable management and governance within government from the perspective of being the director of DoD Command and Control Research. And he's had very good data to look at lots of conflicts and complexity and where we've been successful and where we haven't. So he can bring in a lot of insights as to new approaches. And what he is going to emphasize is a shift toward agility as being one of the main enabling factors for government. Lynn Wells, former CIO of DoD, has been enabling the DoD's efforts to think through how do we approach a situation where you might have several 100,000 people or over 1 million people displaced by war or natural disaster, and they have an immediate need for the very basic elements of what would enable them to survive and then come back into some semblance of human livelihood. So Lynn is going to talk about what can we do today for hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars instead of the billions of dollars that we've been thinking about for many of our systems. So a shift in how we can enable a much broader engagement of lots of different new tools. Okay, so I'm just going to give a little bit of background, and I'm going to start with the perspective of one of the pieces that's changing. And there's a community that's arguing that big data is going to make a huge difference. And if you look at the work of Dave Hastings, for example, on the Human Security Index, it gives you a sense of this. So the U.S. government used to decide whether it's doing a good job or not based upon GDP. So as long as we were at the top of the GDP in the world, then we're successful. And we looked at our allies in relationship to how that we linked in terms of our success of GDP. Now at this point, we have much better data. There's an evolution from the Human Development Index in the 1980s saying GDP is not enough. We need to know much more to really think about what affects human health and human security and resilience. But to look at sustainability and resilience going forward in a very dynamic world, we actually have to have a different set of indices. And that's what Dave has done. here it's represented as the U.S., but there's a global human security index now for 232 countries, and now we've got the U.S. mapped down to the county level. So I think it's 3,000 some odd counties. However, where we're going in some of this discussion may enable us to have even better data down to the neighborhood level. And what does that mean? If we have data that gives us indicators from the hyper-local level, does that change our ability to create better outcomes? So that's one dimension of this. In terms of the issue of Crisis 3.0, what we're talking about here is not the very local emergencies or the bigger local emergencies that require some sharing of resources between jurisdictions. We're talking about the level 3, 4, and 5 disasters and crises. And the distinction between level 3, 4, and 5 may not be just in the scale of the physical emergency. The difference between, for example, a Katrina and what's going on in Haiti or in Japan now is partly due to the physical impact, but it also has to do with the psychosocial dimensions and the socioecological dimensions. So a severity level 4, we're talking about a circumstance in which the public trust is now in jeopardy and may have been lost. Okay? And in severity level 5, where the crisis is of such a scale or complexity that it is actually degrading the social ecology, causing a collapse of population. So the Irish potato famine is a very obvious one, but we also see this historically in many, many collapses of societies, the Mayan Empire, Easter Island, and so on. But we have circumstances today in the United States where Detroit and Flint, Michigan, for example, Detroit was at 2.3 million people, and it's now somewhere around 800-something thousand people. So that's a collapse of social ecology. In that case, that was solved through out-migration. But there are other circumstances in which collapses might not enable out-migration. For example, in Haiti, can there really be an out-migration from Haiti if they overextend carrying capacity? So we're talking about these large-scale crises, big impact, high complexity, but also big psychosocial and socioecological dimensions to it. And the question is, in these circumstances, with social networks and new forms of governance, can we pull back a severity level 4 event in which the public loses trust back into a severity level 3, or perhaps stop a loss of public trust to have a much better outcome? One of the ways that that's often done is to reduce the fear of the public. But what if the circumstances in which they're fearful about actually is material? And in those circumstances, we may not want to reduce fear. It may be better to deal with the fear and perhaps some of the loss of trust initially to avoid a collapse in social ecology. And those are some of the really hard issues that we've got to face in times of transition. Now, another thing we're going to touch on is the difference between Web 2.0 social media as it exists today, and we all know that it's a double-edged sword with the Arab Spring and with Occupy. We know these technologies can be used also to take down institutions as well as to enable better response in emergencies. But what about governance? What do we do about governance in a time when the general public may be better informed than the responders, in terms of the local circumstances, and may have now an emerging collective intelligence that allows them to be solving the problems before the responders arrive. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And there may be multiple perspectives on this. But what is the nature of governance in a time when perhaps the government will no longer have the definitive first information to provide the public anymore? Now, we're not going to talk just about downsides. There's also potentially a huge upside, and that is if you look at Rifkin's book on the Third Industrial Revolution, and there's an argument that this is not an industrial revolution actually, but something that's post-industrial. But when there's a revolution in energy and a revolution in communications simultaneously, there's the possibility of a huge economic benefit. And in this case, because of the nature of these technologies, that economic benefit may be hyper-local, meaning that it could generate a lot of jobs in the communities themselves. Key to this is going to be knowledge. How do we build the systems that enable the whole society to be sharing knowledge in ways that allow for better collective decision-making? So in terms of social media and governance, the knowledge management issues in these severe crises have to be thought through. What do these knowledge management systems look like? What is the role of social media in some of the downside issues of riots and civil disobedience? And how does the government or other elements of society begin to deal with these new phenomena? Is it really the right solution to put the police up against youth that are trying to express something about changes that they want to engage? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But there are some opportunities potentially to drive the systems towards solutions with a much broader participation in what we might call a fifth-generation management and governance system that enables a convergence of smart swarms or intelligent social networks. So one of the things that we've been contemplating and talking about is there something that might be called a Web 3.0 intelligent social network? That instead of having just Web 2.0 technology as it is today, which has no evidence and no science base, but it's very good at creating flocking behavior of tens of thousands and in some cases millions of people. Can we enable that kind of collective action, but with underlying evidence, an underlying science base, underlying knowledge management system that can direct action, that can be solution-oriented, and that engages what might be called integrative power? And we'll get into that. But most important, potentially, is it has to enable a type of governance that can be effective and resolve conflicts as well as enable this convergence. And one of the capabilities that we've been talking about that might enable this is what's called resilient systems. And one way to think about them is as Web 3.0 complex adaptive systems. So Facebook and Twitter are examples of Web 2.0 social networks. They're very good at creating relationship. They're very good at creating simple, uniform behaviors collectively. But in these resilience systems and their nested subsystems down to the neighborhood level, aggregated up through to the metropolitan level, regional level, state level, national level, and global level, they have the ability to be semantically deep, have the evidence, the science base, but in addition, potentially using the cloud to create a new phenomenon. Not only situational awareness that might come out of a network, but potentially something that we might consider to be societal mind. The collective engagement of millions of sensors, computers, cell phones, simultaneously in real time. What would it mean if we can have hyper-local information for neighborhoods to be able to take action before a problem explodes? So, for example, in a neighborhood in San Francisco recently with the natural gas pipelines, if there was the ability for sensors to have informed the people in that network, in that neighborhood, before the explosion, there would probably have been no loss of life. But in larger, more complex disasters, in the severity level 3, 4, and 5 crises, what would it mean to have this kind of societal mind, collective ability to respond? So I'm going to leave it there for the time being. And Dave, do you want to lay out what you're thinking about from the 2030 perspective?
Be happy to. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'd like to kind of frame a few brief remarks in two contexts. First, what are some of the challenges? And then second, what's the opportunity space, at least as we've started to look at it, and some of the pathways for exploring that opportunity space. The world's changing. It's changing in pretty substantial ways in many different contexts. We're certainly here talking about technology, and that's one very obvious way that we're experiencing change, but at the same time, you're seeing radical shifts in the nature of how the supply chain functions over the last 20 years, let alone projecting that forward. You're seeing significant demographic change, changes in the core age of populations in different parts of this country and in different parts of the world. For the first time in human history, more people live in urban centers than in rural areas, and that urbanization trend is intensifying. You see shifts in the nature of the climate. Regardless of the discussion you want to have about cause, already experienced changes in the climate that we're dealing with that are shifting and altering disaster patterns, frequency, and intensity, and will over time. You're seeing resource constraints as a function of the state of the global economy as well as governmental budgets at every level. All sorts of changes happening around us. And so part of our activity stream has been to seek to understand what do those changes portend for the business of crisis response, disaster management, and how do we increase resilience in the face of that. So to boil down what we've found in a nutshell, we see an operating environment that is increasingly one of growing complexity and decreasing predictability. More and more, we are having to confront this issue of uncertainty. And that is a challenge because most of the tools that we employ are really designed to hedge out uncertainty and focus in on what we have a higher degree of confidence about. And so the more we're pushing out in how we assess risk, in how we think about and focus our actions and plan for the things that we're most likely to deal with, the more we set ourselves up for the danger of strategic surprise and large-scale catastrophe. One of the impacts of globalization is the increasing ability of crises and disasters to leap from one context to another, right? So the volcano eruption in Iceland and the corresponding disruption that had across a range of industries, or the slowdown in auto production in the U.S. as a function of the catastrophe in Japan. Those sorts of things that you see start to happen more and more, along with music, which is great. So as we project that forward and try to understand, not from a predictive sense, but from an insight sense, we see more and more crises stacking up on one another and cascading more broadly and more rapidly than in past experience. That's all happening at the same time as we're beginning to experience real changes in the role that individuals play in society, shifts in how people consume and have access to information, as well as in where they place their trust. So just a couple of anecdotes around that to kind of lend color to what I'm talking about. One of the findings that emerged from some of our work was the reality that the average person today in the United States is exposed to 3 times as much information every day as in the 1980s, and that the rate of increase is 30% a year. And so that explains why at least I'm overwhelmed trying to triage all my different inboxes and how many different devices I'm walking around with to manage that. But one of the knock-on effects of that is it's contributing to a real shift in how people are using their social networks. And this is technology enabled, but this is not a function of technology. And so you're seeing more and more people turning to their social networks as sentinels to flag information that I care about, as validators of how important that information is, as well as how accurate it is, and as platforms for action, for mobilization. And so you see real changes in the influence that a single person can exert. And we've got lots of different examples you can find of this. You can look at political examples, how, the case of a single blogger embarrassing the administration by getting a political appointee fired in the span of hours in a way that was simply impossible 5 or 10 years ago. I heard a great story on NPR a couple of years ago about a woman who bought an appliance from a major international or transnational corporation, and it didn't work right. And after several calls for tech support, it still didn't work right, and so she tweeted about it. She had 1 million followers on Twitter, and all of a sudden she's not just one customer to a large company. And so the whole nature of balance in that relationship is changing in ways that are not always predictable and frequently surprising. And if you haven't ever done a YouTube search for flash mobs, you should, both for the disruptive, a visual illustration of the disruptive power of mobilization in the sense, as well as, you can think about what the opportunity is for that kind of coordinated action through social networks. So all of this is also happening as we're confronting resource constraints at every level. And that's a function both of current limitations on budgets in the governmental sector and economic conditions, but it's also a function of, even under the rosiest of pictures, the problem space is becoming more challenging more quickly than we can envision resource growth to support it. So the last point I'd kind of add in coloring the challenges is we're very comfortable thinking about all of this in the context of acute events. There's a flash, there's a thing, there's something specific that has happened that focuses our attention. We are also very much talking about changes in chronic conditions over time. So issues of drought, issues of slow onset change that is nonetheless producing new normal baselines over the period of years that are very significant and have real impacts and may affect migration flows, disease patterns, et cetera. And so where do we confront those kinds of challenges in our current paradigms? But it's not all difficult. There are simple realities that give us insight into the opportunity space. So in the context of our business in FEMA and dealing with disasters, one of those simple truths is that the public is almost always the first responder. It's citizens, it's people helping people, neighbors, et cetera, almost always the first ones on scene. And there are lots of examples of this in the context of prevention of terrorist attack as well that we can point to. So the public is a resource. The reality is we're dealing with inherently societal challenges. These are not challenges or difficulties. Crises and disasters don't only affect governments. They affect societies, and that includes businesses, that includes civil society, nonprofit organizations, NGOs, community-based organizations, interest groups, et cetera. And they all have skin in that game. And so there is opportunity for connecting with a broader network of capacity than we may typically default to in the kinds of issues that we're used to dealing with. And so this is where that level of severity of the crisis or of the problem space really matters, is the kinds of things we're most worried about are beyond the capacity of the governmental sector to deal with on its own. And note I said the governmental sector. I did not say the federal government or state government or any particular government. The aggregate capacities of government are insufficient to deal with the tasks. And so put that together with the comment I made a moment ago about the fact that we all have skin in the game together on the set of issues, and we ought to be thinking substantively differently about how we are pooling capability, pooling resources in a way to address some of those challenges. Another point that opens up space here, and then I'll try to wrap this to a close, is the disaster itself in our context is just one variable in the equation. We're very used to thinking about what we do to mitigate the impacts of that disaster in the context of the built environment. We're used to thinking about how we prepare for that disaster, how we respond to it, how we recover from it. We do all of those things to varying degrees of effectiveness, but they're all oriented around disaster impacts. The reality is the disaster interacts with underlying social conditions in communities every bit as much as it does with physical conditions, with the built environment. And that interaction produces the effects that we then have to respond to, recover from, et cetera. And so the degree to which we enhance our understanding of what those pre-existing conditions are, those underlying conditions, and what works well in communities on an everyday basis, the more we can connect with that through the issues that have mobilized time, attention, resources on an everyday basis for everyday purposes, the more we'll be able to bring that capacity to bear collectively in the moment of crisis. And so one of the two documents that Mike held up is a doctrinal shift or a doctrinal evolution, at least, in the practice of emergency management that seeks to understand how we better do that. The value proposition that underpins all of this is that a community-centric approach to disaster management that lies in strengthening and adapting the things that work well in communities on an everyday basis would offer a more successful path to enhancing security and resilience overall, and that at every level. So we see a lot of space here to explore, and we see tremendous opportunity for emerging and existing technologies to enable that. Social media is a very powerful tool in this sense, but that means expanding the nature of the dialogue and the nature of the engagement, broadening who's at the table, opening up the space, opening up the planning environments, and being receptive to the flows of information, not just conscious about the mechanisms through which we're pushing information, but make that a meaningful exchange in a multi-directional fashion. So I will leave it at that for now and look forward to the continuing discussion.
Okay, our hope is to have an hour or close to an hour for open discourse. But if there are one or two questions that relate to questions of information, is there something that needs to be clarified at this point? Okay. All right, so I'm going to suggest we go on because we're going to dig deep into some of these issues in the discourse. Dave Alberts, why don't you go ahead? I'll give you the clicker here. Arrow to the right.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Mike. Well, let's see if I can work this. Hey, how about that? I'd like to build upon a couple of things that David Kaufman mentioned by sort of taking a look at the nature, the kinds of crises we face, and what the implications that has for management. And I put management in quotes, which I think should give you an idea of what I think about management, and the fact that we obviously need to rethink our traditional approaches. I'll illustrate some of this with a little research results from a lot more evidence that we've collected, and then just suggest a way forward that I think that the different participants, those, as David says, with skin in the game, can do to actually help them or position them to be more effective, not only in of themselves, but in working with others, so that the information that's collectively available and the assets that all the participants can bring to the game can be more effectively used. So I call these complex endeavors. And some of us, we focus on the complexity of the task and environment and forget that that's what's really driving the nature of the response. And it's the response that what I want to focus on today and how you make that more effective. So if we take a look, this is a slide that I adapted from those that I used. Sorry?
Slide didn't change.
Didn't change. Okay. This one I adapted from a military perspective. But the real point of this is that all of these problems are multidimensional. It's not just a military one or a health one, but there are political and social dimensions, and they're all interconnected. So if I have expertise in maybe one of them, I certainly don't in the others. And so it's quite possible that my perception of the problem is only going to be partially correct, and the kinds of solutions that I might implement if left to my own devices may actually make the problem worse. I'll give a quick military example. There's military doctrine goes back a long time, and protecting one's flanks is considered to be just basic. And so in Iraq, an Air Force person wanted to help out the Army by taking out a bridge, but didn't realize that bridge also happened to carry a major oil pipeline. And so there wasn't any urgent military reason for it. It was just sort of what you normally do. And yet it had a set of adverse consequences that the person was not aware of at the time that they made the decision. So how what one institution does impacts others is something we need to find ways to deal with more effectively. Now, to sort of deal with the complexity of self, we have a couple of tendencies here. One, we think that however we think and organize is really appropriate for everyone else. That if we could only get other people to think our way, that somehow the problem would be solved. We don't pay full attention to the diversity, not only in objectives, but culture and perceptions. And so we aren't good partners, so to speak. And what I'd like to address here is how do you, quote, manage this collection of disparate participants in a way that enables them to the extent possible, effectively contribute to the solution. Okay, so I think David mentioned some of these things, but this is sort of an example of what assumptions that many of our institutions bring to the table that is not true, and how that we need to come up with a new way of organizing ourselves so we can achieve the kind of focus that's necessary. This point was previously made, and one that we tend to ignore since it's unpleasant, but we can't really understand these things as well as we would like to. And that has a number of implications in terms of how we make decisions and what we value. For the most part, most of our organizations focus on being more and more effective in a limited set of circumstances that we've lived with for a while and that we assume will go on indefinitely. And yet, the kind of environment that we're approaching here and having to deal with not only is beyond our complete understanding, but is subject to all sorts of disturbances that we can't predict. And so we'll get back to this in a few minutes, but it's not only who we are that's changed, but the nature of our preparation for the challenges we face that's changed. So if we look at how we could think about organizing, there's this metaphorical space These dimensions are not independent ones, and it's not a square. But if you think about how do decision rights get allocated among all the different parties, what kinds of interactions take place between and among them, and how does information get disseminated, you can sort of put pretty much any way you can think of organizing somewhere in this cube. And so what we're used to in terms of hierarchies, at least in the organizations I've dealt with over the years, is they're pretty centralized in terms of decision rights. They have fairly well prescribed and stovepiped interactions, and information is disseminated on a kind of need-to-know basis. So they're sort of optimized for a certain set of problems, but not very effective at others. If you conceive of a more sort of different set of possibilities that move you from the hierarchy to what I've called the edge, which has a lot of the characteristics of social networks, there are points in between that you can sort of say, well, this represents coordination and this represents collaboration. The labels aren't important, but what you're changing is the way those three things I mentioned are done. It's how widely are decision rights allocated among the players, what kinds of patterns of interaction take place, and where information is. Now, about 15 years ago now, we had this idea in the military that if we could only develop sufficient levels of shared awareness, we could enable self-synchronization. And to some degree that worked, and worked well. And if we take this idea in terms now of not one institution, but lots of different participants, then the idea is how do you enable the kind of shared awareness that's necessary for a whole bunch of disparate organizations, at least not to get in each other's way, and hopefully to develop the kind of synergies that we'd like to see. So, some research results. Well, there was a tendency at some point to say, well, let's just make everything an edge organization, and we'll have emergent leadership, and everything will be fine. The problem is that edge organizations have a tendency to generate lots of transactions, some of which are very useful and some of which are not necessary. And in the experiments we ran, edge organizations could deal with a lot of things hierarchies couldn't, but when there was a lot of noise and uncertainty in the environment, they would basically run out of time. There would just be too much stuff they had to deal with, too many interactions, too much information. And so what you really have to find is a way to strike a balance between enabling the kinds of interactions that hierarchies don't allow or don't encourage, and not at the same time overburden everyone with a lot of information and decision-related workload that's going to essentially adversely impact their performance. This is just one slide out of hundreds of a set of experiments that were run in which there are a whole bunch of variables that we played with. There were different types of mission challenges that differed in terms of complexity. There were different cognitive challenges. There were different organizational forms that were tried out, different levels of noise, different performance of the network, the communication network, and so forth. And those different approaches that I indicated before, we mapped onto this space. If it's colored, it means that there was an organizational form that actually could satisfy all of the requirements of that particular mission challenge. And the colors correspond to the organizational form that actually was the most efficient for that set of circumstances. Two takeaways: there is no one-size-fits-all solution. And so this basically points to a hypothesis that if organizations could conceivably think of themselves not as having a fixed form of organization, but one that they could adapt to the situations they were in, then it is quite possible they could be more effective over a wider range of circumstances, and that's the essence of agility. Those are some of the enablers that make people, systems, organizations more or less agile. And so the thing that I sort of have come to the conclusion is if each of the institutions and entities that we've been talking about would start to think in terms of their agility rather than their effectiveness in today's particular set of circumstances, then they would be better equipped to work with one another in complex and uncertain kinds of endeavors. That's it.
Okay. Most of that was pretty simple and straightforward, but there's points of question. Yes.
Well, there were a series of, one part of it was done under a NATO research group. So there were a bunch of case studies that went back and looked at particular real-world things, including the tsunami and smaller disasters like the Elbe River flood in Germany, as well as war games and simulations. The really neat results come from simulations, many of which involve people in 7 or 8 different countries. Later on, those people were replaced by little software agents because they're cheaper to feed and stuff. And so you could run a lot more experiments that way. So that particular chart comes from a simulation, because real world doesn't have all those conditions. So you need to simulate them.
Yes.
Albert, one point. Crisis can be considered in some ways in the eyes of the beholder. If you look at the current situation of today, we are having a problem with drugs for cancer. So for parents that have a child with cancer, not having the ability to get that drug is a major crisis.
Mm-hmm.
In their eyes, agility means effectiveness. So,
Well, that's true. In any given one instance, agility is effectiveness. You can't be agile unless you're effective. I mean, by definition, the way I'm using the word. So agility says, how do you stay effective when circumstances change? So, for example, in the case you're saying, that child may not be able to get the drug in that city, but maybe they could get it in a different city. Or maybe they could go out on the internet and find it somewhere, or something. So there may or may not be things that people can do to increase the likelihood that they'll find a solution.
just one minor
Okay, it's gotta
comment.
be quick.
Yes. In this particular case, you're dealing with an infrastructure, a pharmaceutical, that it's privately owned. It's not the government in some ways. And therefore, the levels of complexity that you mentioned at the beginning, I think that link is it's a major concern that sometimes the government cannot do too much. But
The other thing is you could look at that as an instance and step up and look at a larger problem of, pharmaceutical availability, things like that, medical systems, and they're very complex, right?
Okay, so we're going to go deeper into this soon. But Lynn, would you like to?
So just a few points. First of all, I think when you talk about resilience, you have to think in terms of people, processes, organizations, and technology. There's not going to be any single silver bullet that's going to solve this problem. So how do you deal with the interactions? One of the things that we've looked at has been some principles for knowledge sharing. And this is partly incorporated in the Star Tides project at NDU, star-tides.net if you're not familiar with it. But the basic point is that to start with leveraging global knowledge. None of us has a monopoly on all the good ideas. Then look at how you do cross-cutting approaches across infrastructures, across concepts, across organizations. And finally, the long-term sustainment sort of has got to come through the citizens and the private sector. Government is not going to be the long-term solution to any of this. So how do we find the mechanisms for public-private cooperation that enable you to do this? But the technology alone is never enough. And so you've got to look at things like building social networks and developing trust. How do you get people to want to work together? Often there are high-level policies that are pretty good, doctrines that get the... But unless the field operating procedures align with those, you're going to fail on the ground. So how can you find ways to make sure that people on the ground, on the deck plates, actually understand what the policies are and are executing in ways that reinforce them rather than undercut them? A third piece, you need to understand the legal and regulatory constraints under which you work. Can you get a solution through customs? Will you run across posse comitatus if DOD is coming to support disaster relief? Where do the resources come from? And then finally, how do you change behaviors? Because until you change behaviors, you're never going to get to a lesson learned. You're going to get to a lesson observed, and then next year you'll come back and you re-observe the same lesson, and then you re-observe the same lesson. And the way you get to lessons learned is a combination of training, exercises, and education, but it has to go beyond that. The organizational has to learn. So all of us in this room can be trained, exercised, and educated and change our behaviors, but unless our organizations incorporate that learning, as soon as we rotate out, we're going to be back to square one. So what is the basis for organizational learning? We're looking at a couple of four broad areas, which we're terming for the moment quick wins at low cost. You know, these are things that can be done fairly quickly without, the goal is to deploy capabilities in months for thousands of dollars rather than decades for billions of dollars, as Mike said at the beginning. One is to do a better job of making use of crowdsourced information and the extraordinary availability now of open source imagery and the volunteer communities that go with it, crisis mappers, people like this. And these are folks who are out there who are willing to spend their time, willing to provide their expertise in disaster-type situations. Have we built the bridges from our organizations to allow us to take advantage of it? So that's the first piece. The second is we need to find ways to keep our organizations from being overwhelmed by the volume and velocity of information generated by social media and the 24/7 news cycle. The point made about just the amount of transactions that are generated, the amount of information generated by social media. Find what are we doing to make our organizations more responsive. There's a British journalist by the name of Nick Gowing who's written a book called Sky Full of Lies and Black Swans. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. Talking about the volume and velocity of information. The third piece is to leverage better commercial supply chains. For those of you who don't know, the national NVOAD, the National Voluntary Organizations Assisting in Disasters, there are 40,000 companies, a member of this, who have indicated a willingness to work with state, local, tribal, federal governments after disasters. Again, this is expertise that's out there. Shame on us for not finding ways to make use of it. And then finally, look for developing capabilities through bottom-up approaches rather than top-down. Both NATO and the U.S. government have a number of initiatives in place to look, for example, at command and control or agility-focused convergence or ways we tie things together. And if you look at Organization A and Organization B, Organization C, see how they're doing it, and then find ways to link them together and build the solution, interoperable solution from the bottom up, rather than trying to start with some new top-down common operating picture that's going to take forever to build. So those four things, the crowdsourced information, the social media, the commercial logistics, and the bottom-up approaches, I think can provide some quick wins at low cost. And the last point, just to reinforce what David said earlier, we need to treat citizens not as victims, but as sentient creatures who can help to solve the problem if we give them the tools. You know, government is not going to be there either first or with all the answers. How do we build the cooperative mechanisms that allow us to work together, public-private? Thank you, sir.
Okay, so let's start with point of information, questions of information. For Lynn, anything? Okay, then let's open it up. Any questions? Sir.
Hello. I tweeted this question as well, but the advantage of me being here is that I can also ask it in person. So earlier when you were talking about the different levels of crisis that FEMA and the government should feel like they should be leveraging social media to respond to, level 5 was it seemed to be non-natural disaster related population decline and societal decay, as you said, so over large periods of time, such as what's happening in Detroit. And so I'm wondering how exactly are you planning to use social media, which is a very of-the-moment 24/7 thing, to combat slow crises like population decline, A, and B, why does the government even need social media to tell them that there are not as many people living in Detroit right now?
Yeah. So first of all, it could be any kind of catalyst. It could be a natural disaster. It could be a war. Many times it's environmental collapse that causes these severity level 5 crises, where the social ecology collapses and you can't maintain the populations. There isn't enough food, there isn't enough water, or there are other factors that limit the population's ability to survive there. In a circumstance in which they can out-migrate, that's a less severe event than one in which they can migrate out to someplace else. So Detroit, the catastrophe is not so much in the loss of life as it was in the Irish potato famine to some degree, but that was also an out-migration. Let's go to Haiti. Now you got 9 million people officially, but probably 10.5 million people in that country. It used to support the ecosystem services supported 5.5 million people, but now it only supports 2.5 million people because 98% of the country is deforested. 54 of the 56 watersheds are now degraded to the point where you have cholera in essentially all those watersheds.
You classified Haiti as level 4.
It's a level 4 plus.
I guess, could you elaborate
That's
on
somewhat of a euphemism. It's only a matter of time. That you can't support that level of population under current conditions. But here's what you can do. So we've proven that we can take the top off of outbreaks. We just were in one in southern Haiti, and we know how to do it. It's not a complicated thing to do. We need now to divide up the country into 760 health capacity zones, and we need to be able to gather data on 16 mission-critical functions with about 10 questions per mission-critical function. So it's a big data problem. We have to be able to have a lot of data on lots of pieces of the country that nobody's ever known what the conditions are. It's never been recorded. They don't even know when people live in, are born and die in some of those areas. So we're now gathering lots of data and laying the foundation for taking the top off the cholera epidemic, which, by the way, will translocate again beyond Haiti and Dominican Republic to other places in the Western Hemisphere if we don't get it managed. So it has to be managed, and when you manage it, you lay the foundations for other types of resilience infrastructure. Now, I don't want to take too much time, but that's the basic structure in which we're approaching this. And it's one of the problems that we're looking at for the Rio Global Sustainability Conference. Can we use big data to attack these kinds of wicked problems? And the answer is probably yes, but it's going to be resource intensive and very data intensive.
Did FEMA have anything to add, Mr. Kaufman?
I can't speak to the Haiti part of this, but I can just come at it from the standpoint of why we think social media offers power in that space. What we're inherently talking about is how do you connect actors in ways that are meaningful and provide meaningful exchange, and do it through entry issues that are of relevance on an everyday basis. And I think the social media technologies offer one path for doing that. They're not the only path. Technology is not an equal opportunity space in and of itself. There are inequalities at play there as well. But in the aftermath of a really large-scale disaster, one of the things that we've learned it's really important to do is to quickly engage the population in the visioning process that drives the recovery. Another of the sort of simple truths that we've stumbled across is communities that really successfully recover drive their own recovery. It's organic. It's not driven by any one sector. It's not any one actor's vision. It's messy. It's a blending. There are winners and losers implicit in that, but it is an organically driven process. So how do you jumpstart that process as rapidly as possible? Because the quicker you can get that engagement, the quicker you can get those voices brought together into a common space and work through the many different sets of issues that are involved in that, the quicker you can make progress on the other end. And so we're talking about ways of linking and connecting that people are already utilizing for a whole lot of sets of reasons. And there's power in figuring out how to connect with that, how to hear from that, how to turn those into opportunities for voice in these kinds of processes that don't involve building whole replicate systems that sit idle that no one ever engages with until something happens, but rather are about, integrating within the things that people are already doing. And as I said, so some of this is what do people give of their time and energy to? Could be social causes, could be cleaning up the neighborhood park, could be youth athletics, could be any number of different things that they're already organizing around and mobilizing around for everyday sets of issues. But those are engagement points. And so then the challenge is, how do you mobilize that engagement? And that's where some of these technologies offer real power.
Okay. I want to, oh yes, Lim.
So if you're not familiar with it, DARPA has just kicked off a new project called CIMISC, Social Media and Strategic Communication. The rollout meeting was 31st January, 1 February. And the basic point is to look at, and this is DARPA basic science type project, can you in fact invent a social network science that will basically be a big data, petabytes of data processed by teraflops of processing to better understand the propagation of narratives and memes through networks to give you a better understanding of emergent behaviors before they become obvious. And so while it may not be, as you say, in the long-term decline of a society, it may allow you to identify some emergent points before they fall off a cliff to allow you to mitigate the consequences. CIMISC is the project.
And first, Lynn, you had a question about Haiti and how do you gather the data and so on. I'll address that quickly and I think address a piece of your question which I didn't answer. So one of the differences that we had in using intelligent social networks and crowdsourcing in Haiti versus the traditional methodology of sentinel sites, in a cholera epidemic, it moves extremely fast. So you could have 5 cases the first day, 50 cases the next day, with 5 deaths. You could have in the next day 500 cases and 15 or 20 deaths. So you have to be able to respond quickly. What we were able to do is to have real-time querying of 1,200 people across Haiti that were nodes within social networks and organizations that enabled a very rapid pinging across the country. So what we found was that we could get information very quickly and verify it within usually an hour or several hours, and then send helicopters or trucks out and stop it in the first day or the second day. That meant not only did we save lives, a tremendous amount of lives that you couldn't do with sentinel systems, but you also lowered the social distance, because what was happening in some of these villages is people were, when you'd have 10 kids die in a village, people would get chopped up with machetes or get hung thinking that they had done voodoo. So it was very important to the social integrity of these communities, in which in some cases it looked like 30 or 50% of the people were going to die.
We have 2 questions from the Twitter sphere. They both asked the same question. How are the panelists and the moderator using social media, social network tools in their own professional work today?
Okay.
So one of the, I mentioned the Star Tides network earlier. One of the projects that Tides has both Facebook and LinkedIn presence, and encourage you please both go check it out and friend us. In addition, we've participated recently in the Exercise 24 Mexico, which if you're not familiar with the Exercise 24 series, these are a series of virtual exercises being run out of San Diego State that are basically online. The Exercise 24 Europe that was run last year had something like 49,000 participants from 92 countries. I haven't seen the stats from Exercise 24 Mexico, but we were engaged in that as well. So both in tweeting things about Tides and using LinkedIn, and then the Tides website itself is designed to be a knowledge-sharing research project. So hopefully that's getting the word out.
Well, we're not in the Twitter sphere yet, but what we found out some time ago is that if we sort of put out our publications on the internet and sort of encourage responses, that we could quickly get a flavor for what people understood or what their concerns were, and come out with a much, much better final product than we could in the past, where we sent it out to our favorite subset of reviewers. So this basically enabled us to connect with people we had no idea who they were, who were interested in our things from a variety of different perspectives. So we've done that. Research is not something we do in real time necessarily, but so we'll have to think about how to move that process along.
So I'll try to, I won't do justice, but I'll try to give at least a partial answer to that question from the standpoint of Federal Emergency Management Agency. And I'll really speak to it in the context of Web 2.0 technologies in general. So in no particular order, in the purely social media space, we have aggressively advanced our presence and tried to utilize those mechanisms as ways to open dialogue and communication. We have, in the context of different initiatives, the Strategic Foresight Initiative being a nice example of that, used collaborative workspace environments online as places to build knowledge, build content, and open up dialogue and engage participation and viewpoints in the actual development of insight. We've done that in the context of implementation of Presidential Policy Directive 8 on national preparedness, using IdeaScale. We've done that in other examples as well. We're currently doing something similar. We're beginning to embark on something similar, internally focused with respect to our own workforce, and looking at those technologies as ways to create conversation space for our own employees internally around different sets of issues of concern to them. We're focusing on getting out of sort of the static production of images and into the production of dynamic data feeds and making those publicly available in the areas that we can. And we are really beginning to look at how do we invert that and think about how we can create mechanisms that allow us to receive publicly provided information and data. We don't have all those solutions in place, but those are things that we're aggressively working at, and there are folks in the room that are far more knowledgeable on that than I am, that I can refer to for anybody who's interested.
This is a difficult question for me to phrase. Hopefully somebody's a social anthropologist here. But how do we create in our own culture and internationally a culture of agility? Because right now we have a culture of information. We want more and more information. We spend more time digesting information than we do actually understanding it and having the knowledge of it. And typically and I'm talking about senior officials and people who need to be making decisions. If they're uncomfortable with making a decision, what do? They ask for more information, which just delays it. In many cases, the right decision is almost a gut feel by somebody, and they just go out and do it. Some of the things I've seen in disasters, one of the most effective disaster responses I've seen for small business came from a guy who ran A1 equipment rentals in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And he really banded together an awful lot of people and turned into a very effective thing over a period of several years. But how do we instill a culture or build a culture of agility? We see things in resilience. Many of you know about CARI, the Community and Regional Resilience Institute. And I've several times asked them, we know what we need to do, but we have no incentive to do it. So how do you incentivize people to build a culture of agility rather than a culture of information? And I'm not sure how to do that, because otherwise we just keep talking about this stuff. And you guys have made some great comments, and I won't repeat them all because this is turning into more, not a question any longer. But you get, hey, some great comments are right on, but the bottom line comes in, how do you create this culture of agility?
David Alberts.
Well, that's something I share your interest in. I've been thinking about that not quite long enough to come up with a decent answer. But I think it's creating an awareness that you can prepare for the future, not by essentially practicing one way of doing it, but by over time stressing your exercises or your education so that people are constantly being forced in a position where they don't know what the correct solution is, yet they have to do something to make people more comfortable with a different sort of risk-taking. Okay, right now they're asking for information, which is a somewhat risk-averse thing, without understanding that they are risking total disaster by not acting in a reasonable period of time. And so this is just endemic, as you point out. So I think it has to sort of be infiltrated in at all parts of the educational system, and our training has to be different. To sort of, we've talked about the notion of, instead of places where you sort of shoot training, shooting ranges, but decision ranges and things like that. And hopefully we can make some progress along those lines.
I think actually we have a basis to build on in John Boyd's OODA loop. And it's a concept that's known in lots of places and adopted, but one always talks about cycling through the OODA loop faster than one's opponents. And the OODA loop is, by definition, iterative. When you re-observe to see if the engagement is converging to your desired result, and if it's not, then you do something different. So, because in almost any one of these wicked interactive problems, you're never going to get the answer right the first time, and anything you do is going to begin to affect the rest of the problem. The solution is going to be iterative. And so to some extent, agility is built into the OODA loop model, in the sense that if you want to cycle through the OODA loop faster than your opponent, you've got to be more agile at making through that decision. The types of problems we're talking about here are going to be not, steadfast, resolute, one decision forever, but an iterative approach. And so I think we have at least a model we could use to begin to incorporate into the education and training process that's not a total cold start.
People are internally motivated, and they're not constrained by rules of hierarchical systems. They move pretty fast if they're resourced to do so. But if you have multiple layers of decision-making and authorities involved, that takes a long time. So one of the things that we've been talking about is, how do you create horizontal management and governance? And how do you do that in such a way that doesn't come in conflict with the vertical systems? So you have to build integrative management and governance of vertical and horizontal systems, and we can get into that more.
got a backlog of 4 questions already, so I think this gentleman here, and then we've got one here, and then here and there. Okay.
Okay, I wanted to point out something about it relates to information, and when Mike put his last chart showed all the counties of the United States, and then he mentioned something that now we go basically to the human and to the individual rather than just the county, and this brings a very interesting connection. A few days ago, the BBC gave an article that came on a journal, Lancet, where basically the author compares an estimate of people with malaria of being 655,000 for 2010, while these people now confirm 1.24 million. So more than double of the people. So in terms, there is a word that we have not discussed, which is accuracy. Mm-hmm. And if you're planning, if you have estimates that you get from Google, from this, from that, might be great, but how do you define that accuracy? Because that's what you're going to need if you have to combat a disease, if you have to deal with a major disaster. And I think this brings an incredible, powerful point of getting the information from the site. We tend to forget that right now, if you go to every country in the world, each country has a complete different philosophy of what is a crisis. The Syrians are going with their stuff, the Russians with their stuff, we go with our stuff. And if you go to Greece or everywhere else, so it's very difficult if you do something like a reality show where you ask people to vote, and of course 61% of the people live in Asia, they will always win every vote if this was a real-time vote in terms of social media. But my point is that very complex systems, but yet the ability to get accuracy, I think it's the most invaluable piece.
Did the panelists want to comment on that?
Well, there was a time when people actually believed that the sources of information they had were accurate. Clearly they weren't entirely correct. But today, when you have such an explosion of sources, the problem is, how do you develop assessments of the veracity of this multitude of sources? And the only way we have come up with today to deal with that is to essentially have a disparate number of people weigh in on whether or not they think that particular report is credible or not. I don't think it can be done from a single perspective. The assumption is that if you have enough connectivity and enough relationships, that you'll have someone out there that knows a lot more about that than you do. So that's our hope, is that by diversity and inclusivity, we'll start to tackle that problem.
So someone told me, and I obtaining secondhand information, that in the DARPA famous red balloon experiment, this is where they released 10 balloons across the country and held a contest to find out who could locate them first. And this team from MIT actually came up with them in an astonishingly short time. That the MIT team had built into their algorithms deception. And some of the people were intended to purposely put out deceptive information. And one of the things they found in this was what would heretofore have been interpreted as a sort of an A1 source, the balloon is here at 3:33 in the afternoon, was almost always wrong. And that the way they got the most accurate information was converging to, I think it's over in the next field, well, Farmer John said he saw it down the road, and converged to it. So I don't know whether that begins to offer you an approach to this, but I was struck by that, and I need to learn more about just how DARPA did the experiment, because apparently that ambiguity was built into the system.
Okay, one area that I haven't heard a whole lot about, and that's in the context of resiliency, is redundancy. And in a society that is so based on technology and that infrastructure, what happens in times of crisis where there's something so catastrophic, like an EMP, that just decimates the entire electronic grid? I mean, how can we create a culture of agility that then realizes technology is not going to be a good way to produce collaboration. It's back to that very basic instinct community approach and working with others. So my question is, what's your take on building kind of more antiquated systems to facilitate that community approach after a disaster and still have that social media there for maybe the more acute responses that are needed, or chronic responses that still don't have an entire infrastructure blasted by the disaster?
So I'll start. I think it goes back to something that Lynn said earlier, which is that there's no silver bullet, there's no panacea that's going to address all these issues. I think we're talking in particular about one aspect of, the tool space or the resource space that we can work with. It's not going to solve it all on its own, and there are absolutely risks inherent in it. When we looked at technology, the only real clear conclusions that we could derive as we tried to project ahead were we had no idea what the technology was going to look like in 20 years, but we were pretty sure that some of it was going to be very disruptive in both very positive and very negative ways. And so, what do you do with that? Except to understand that for every potential promising technology, there's also a way that can be twisted. And the inverse is also true. The things that people might be very concerned about from a technological standpoint in terms of contributing to new threats also offer opportunities. And so we have to just be conscious of both in how we approach things and thoughtful about the what-ifs and how you build in the fallback systems or the fallback approaches, which may not be technological systems, but maybe, to your point, other ways that we do business to try to achieve whatever the outcome is that we're striving for in a particular set of circumstances.
Right. To sort of build on that, the questioner talked about the culture of agility. Well, one of the slides I put up put 6 sort of related capabilities that sort of collectively add up to agility, and they were flexibility, robustness, resilience, innovation, adaptability, and responsiveness. And if you start to have people develop those skills and those capabilities, when something catastrophically happens, they look to one of these traits to see what the workarounds are, what the fallbacks are, what other ways of skinning the cat are. Now, clearly, you can't expect them to function at the same high level they did when there was a fully functional support system. But that doesn't mean they have to totally collapse either. And right now, I think we're training people to essentially assume that all this great stuff is going to be there and not putting them through enough sort of training and circumstances when that is not there. And that is worrisome.
Lynn?
Leah, can I just...
Yeah, I think that we still want to comment on that.
I'm sorry. Just 3 quick things. One of the things the ISAT, this DARPA's information S&T panel looked at 2 weeks ago was, suppose everything is down. Suppose the grid is down, whether it's a high-altitude EMP or a solar storm or whatever, and therefore the Internet is down and you really have nothing. And so one of the questions was asked was, what's the basic level of communication that a government needs to put out in order to maintain social stability? So this could be, and one of the senses ones the government needs to begin by saying, by establishing the point is, we don't know it all. We're in this with you. We'll share as much as we can and try to help. So it might be to begin with saying, all right, 660 and 88.5 are the 2 frequencies in which we want to get the information out. Then you might be able to say, like, the barter market's going to be in the town square from 9 to noon or something like that. Just what do you basically need to tell people about? And in this communication, the international term for IT is ICT. We're emphasizing the importance of radio in the developing world of getting the word out. Okay. There's a guy named Jim Kraft, who's the Deputy CEO of the Marine Corps, who wrote a paper called Security Six Sigma. And his point is that Lean Six Sigma may be a great way to build cheap Toyotas, but it's not driving all the variance out of your systems and all the spare capacity out of your networks is not a good way to prepare for defense against a sentient entity who's trying to attack your networks. And so the question was, how much slop, how much redundancy do you need to put into a network? And there's actually some work in communications theory about that, what that ought to be. The final point is we've been doing some work on something called a telecommunications availability framework. So imagine a set of columns that is minimum connectivity, 56K dial-up, 768K DSL, full KML, full bandwidth, and the rows then are security, public health, agriculture, things like that. And what the rows are then are what procedures would you put in place for that function if all you had was that kind of bandwidth. So if all you have is SMS texting, you can get a lot of message out. Bridge out on right, take left fork of road, Santa Lucia covered by mudslide, ramp good for 3C-130s, but you got to train people, as Dave said. You've got to interact the education and the policy, the procedures with the technology that's out there. So it seems to me all three of those pieces need to play in this.
One last quick comment, and we'll just hit the top of it and we can talk more later. But the concept of resilience networks down to the neighborhood level are assuming that those neighborhoods are going to be survivable as nodes if everything else goes down. So it requires food and water and all of the dimensions independent of any other systems. So the idea of building these distributed smart grids that go all the way down to the neighborhood level with good assessment as to the state of resilience on all mission critical functions for whatever period of time that neighborhood feels it needs to have that. And I guess the other piece of it is transition town. You should look at transition town. Basically, at 1870, what did they do in that community, and are they prepared to operate like that?
I actually had a comment almost exactly like hers, so I'll just bridge over that from that just a little bit, so we don't repeat the same notions. I think about the things that I worry about sometimes as a former geophysicist and sort of a guy in the military now are the new Madrid seismic zone in the center of the country. Everybody knows about San Andreas in LA, and the building codes can handle quite a bit of shaking out there. But the new Madrid seismic zone could have an 8.0 or higher earthquake based on past geologic records, so that would be absolutely devastating. So let's say we had just enough warning, say a 4 to 6 hour warning that the seismic activity was starting to pick up and that we were about to get a huge earthquake. Now, I know earthquake prediction is not a science, but let's say that we could say, hey, let's worry about what are the likelihoods that this may happen. Or we've got really good intelligence that somebody's going to drop a radiologic weapon in a harbor on the East Coast or the West Coast, some event like that is dramatic. So my question, which is our possibilities in our lifetime, so my question is not maybe an EMP and how the networks go down from that, which is an excellent question. It's more about education of those communities where their risks are high in certain areas, and how do you deal with after with an information, National Command Authority knows something, they transmit it to the population, they say there's a high degree of whatever happening, but now the social network bandwidth limitations are unbelievable. Cell phones are off. I mean, we had the D.C. earthquake, and I couldn't talk on the cell phone for an hour and a half. So how do you get, since so many people rely on that? So my question is, from you all's perspective, how can you, if you will, preload those communities so they don't have to rely on just cell phones, educate them? Do we have the money, and what do we need to do? What are the sort of the Pareto analysis, the top things we need to do right now, say in the next 5 years, to stop this type of thing from, if we have a little bit of warning? That's kind of my, if you will, global question on information and how I know resilience is a good thing, but there's a piece of that that's important, and that's called situation awareness. And that link is very tenuous.
So there's a lot I want to say, so I'll try to just say a few things and keep it tight. First off, there are a whole host of programs working specifically on those issues. Last year, National Level Exercise 11 was on a New Madrid Zone earthquake and the impacts of that, and so that was in all levels of government and outside of government exercise to explore those implications. Coincidentally, this coming year's is a cyber event, which will address some of the issues in the preceding question. so there's that path that we structure large-scale exercises specifically to test what is and isn't working well in the system in that particular kind of set of conditions and issues. But moreover, we've sort of taken a different tact over the last year and a half, 2 years, in how we approach planning for the catastrophic in general. And we've taken the look at it that says, look, you have an initial disaster state, and the first thing you have to do is stabilize it. And if you can't achieve a level of stability, you can't deal with the issues that come after that. So that means a certain set of things, and we've defined that in terms of specific outcomes. Outcomes in the context of emergency communications, access, scene security, care for the injured, life-sustaining commodities and supplies, dealing with the dead, all of those sorts of things. And we've modeled that. And actually one of the gentlemen who was principally driving this is sitting 3 people to your right. So I'll make that referral now, Mike. But we've designed what we've characterized as a meta scenario, which is not a specific scenario. So it's not New Madrid goes, and it's not an IND goes off in this particular city, but it is a set of impact assumptions that put quantitative numbers against those 13 outcomes. So how many dead are we worried about? How many people in need of medical care or mass care? How many people in need of life-sustaining commodities and supplies in what period of time? How large an affected area? All of those sorts of details. The modeling for which drew on modeling for New Madrid, drew on the Great Miami hurricane models and other experiences and modeling efforts around the world. We've tried to composite that and then put those back into the system as planning requirements. It says, here are outcomes that need to be achieved that the current system may or may not have the capacity to get to today. So how do we use that understanding to drive us to think about who else needs to be brought in, how we need to reconfigure approaches, et cetera. So at least I hope I gave you some insight into the ways that we're tackling those kinds of issues.
I guess the core issue I was asking also is how important is preloading education on the population in these zones for the most likely scenario in those models and the outcomes? How important was that in terms of the outcomes? Could you assess that? That was really kind of part of my question. Could you really assess it?
It's absolutely important, and risk communication and understanding how we internalize and make decisions about that risk. Those are inherently very local sets of issues, but that goes into community planning, into development, land use decisions. All of that is wrapped up together in a way where there's tremendous importance there and tremendous work left to do to understand true risk exposure from our choices and how we bear that risk throughout different aspects of the system.
So just in terms of national education, I mean, FEMA tested the National Emergency Response, whatever it was, Emergency Alert System. How is this kind of the beginning of I remember as a kid we always used to do the nuclear drills, and there were always things on the radio, and they kind of drifted away from it. Are you looking to get back to sensitizing the population to more of this type of alert?
Well, there have been a number of outreach efforts to try to address issues of preparedness and awareness and understanding on these issues over the last 12 years. The READY campaign, the Citizen Corps program, the Community Emergency Response Team programs, a whole host of different activities, some still ongoing, others having morphed. And then if you go back and look at Presidential Directive 8, one of the things that's called for in that is a more aggressive campaign to mobilize sustained citizen participation and preparedness. So we're working through what that entails and how we approach that, but there's no question that how we open dialogue, what we communicate, who we communicate to, how we hear from, all of that is tremendously important. And just a personal note on that, the behavioral sciences have a tremendous amount to contribute to those discussions. There's been an explosion in our understanding about how people make choices, what informs those choices, behavioral economics, et cetera, and the way we can preserve complete freedom of choice, but influence those choices in ways that lead to different outcomes. And we've only begun to think about the applicability of those kinds of insights in this context. But I'd remind all of us that people's decisions in crisis are inherently social. The average person checks in with 4 to 5 other people before deciding what to do under a mandatory evacuation order. And if you don't believe me, look around the next time you're in a building and the fire alarm goes off, because that's what's happening.
I've got a quick comment from the Twitter sphere, and it appears it might be from someone who's young. It's saying that this is not a game for the career mature. And I'm wondering if you have some comments about what FEMA might have done or DoD have done in bringing in insights from the digital natives that have grown up at the age of 4 with a computer or cell phone or other game devices or whatever. Any comments as to when you engage a complete a digitally native generation, do they come up with different solutions in some of this?
So I can't give a complete answer to that. I like that question a lot. One of the sort of guiding principles in our whole community approach to emergency management is that you have to understand what the true needs will actually be when it's really bad. And that means full spectrum needs. So that's just not just the folks we're used to dealing with or the populations or groups that we're used to interacting with, but it's the whole spectrum. And so the issue in the question really drives at the heart of that. So there are a lot of ways to do that. I'm sure we could do it much better than we do. I'll give you one example that's illustrative, but not comprehensive, and it's out of one of our projects in my office, which is the foresight work. And for that, we specifically wanted to know, does today's youth view the challenges of the future differently than, I forget what the term was, career mature, than the career mature. And so we put a couple of workshops together that really looked at brand new professionals and asked them a set of questions that were the same sorts of questions we were asking in other groups and explored what the differences. And there were some differences. And that was a useful activity to undertake. And so I think that it really does drive at that issue of challenging our assumptions. What we believe to be the case may not, in fact, be the case for everybody. And it's always important to step back and think about who was not involved, whose views were not represented, and how do we get those views brought forward.
Thank you. I'd like to bring the conversation back. I'd like to bring the conversation back to governance, and one of the functions of government is to sanction bad behavior, selfish behavior, self-interested behavior. And so I'm wondering, in these social networks and the community response level, how do we build in the appropriate representational processes so that people have the capacity within their communities with people they know to provide that check and balance against bad behavior?
Well, there's lots of forms of bad behavior. The ones that we've looked at are information related, which might include information hoarding, passing on misinformation, that sort of thing. We have been figuring out ways to add assessments that can be added to pieces of information or attached to a variety of sources or players. Not to take the analogy too far, but to your sort of eBay model, where I doubt you would buy from someone who had as low as a 90% positive rating anymore. I mean, your expectation is that that's an important consideration in how you're going to respond to that individual. And then over time, people are going to, again, I'm talking about it from an information point of view, and an interaction point of view, are going to basically ignore that information, not pass it along, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I guess what I'm really getting at is the assessment of the motivations that people bring into this type of social context. And I guess part of what I'm hearing is that there's an assumption that people will behave in a benevolent, altruistic kind of manner, and I would question that and try to encourage a more diverse appreciation of the motivations and the underlying attitudes that go into the use of social media.
So I think, I mean, all you need to do is look at the pictures of downtown Providence after the 1938 earthquake, and the people looting in boats and everything else, and what you think is a fairly stable environment, to realize that there's a very thin veneer of civilization on top of everything we do. So I think your point's well taken. But I think any governance mechanisms that get put in place need to have some kind of periodic reinforcement. I don't know whether it's 6 months. I don't know what it is to keep practicing it. But even if we get something working perfectly today, it's going to decay over time. There's no point in assuming it's not going to. So at what point do you need to come back and retrain, re-educate, rehearse the outcome you want?
Yeah, I would just mention that the bad behavior may not just be at the level of citizens, and I don't think you're necessarily assuming that. There may be incentives at many different levels of the management and governance system. And when you get into very complex times of transition, some of that behavior may really drive the change. I was just in a discussion about the Civil War and the partisan elements of it. The partisans didn't follow the game. What they did was, before the emancipation, they went out and freed the slaves because they could use the slaves as part of their effort, their war effort. And what they found, without knowing it, was that it was a $7-8 billion economy that they were degrading, and that essentially catalyzed the collapse of elements of the Southern economy during the Civil War. So the official systems were focusing on certain rules, but as soon as they began to discover that the old rules had new meaning, then they also began to shift even before it was officially blessed. So was that bad behavior, or was that good behavior? That depends upon who's deciding.
I have a question for Dr. Alberts. In one of your slides, you showed hierarchy and edge in ways that imply that they are polar opposites. I would submit that hierarchy is more about structure and different, possibly, than the modus operandi, the decision-making rules. I think this is related to a tendency of too many people to think of NIMS and emergency response as somehow being built around monolithic organizations where all decisions are made in the central command center, whereas in the military, you have a central command and a commander's intent and distribution of authorities and responsibilities based on geography and so forth, but a lot of the decision-making authority is actually pushed out within those constraints to the edge. And so it's not necessarily a question of hierarchy versus edge. It's a behavioral and allocation of authority issues, centralized versus decentralized. And if it's decentralized with rules or decentralized without rules, think back on one of the exercises that was built around a bioscenario. The mayor of New York tried to evacuate the city, and the mayor of the New Jersey town at the other end of the bridge had the police out with guns to shoot anybody that tried to cross the bridge. Can you comment on that issue?
Which issue?
Well, the difference between hierarchy as a structure and centralization of authority.
Right. Remember, this is really fast, but as I pointed out, those weren't independent dimensions. And so if I actually had to look at one of them, it might be the patterns of interaction as the key to what sort of organizational approach was at work here. There are, of course, levels that it's a question of what your perspective is. If your perspective is the entire institution versus a particular echelon or something like that, you're going to have a different view. there is, as you point out, this notion of mission command, which I just found out the other day. There were, at least in the Army, 4 different definitions, some of which were antithetical to the others. So we think of mission command as basically intent within general competency and doctrine and all of that, with large degrees of freedom of action within that context. Other people don't quite see it that way. So what I was trying to do in the charts was to sort of contrast approaches that essentially had no chain of command with those that did, and the kinds of information dissemination models that you needed to support the functioning of those organizations. Now, normally in hierarchies, situation awareness is not widely shared. It's sort of the situational awareness you have is sort of a function of where you are in the organization. And so your ability to sort of work cross stovepipes is hampered by that. In edges, it's conceivable that you have greater sort of cross-situational awareness, but it's harder to sort of get people on the same page. And so self-synchronization is the way you might want to do that. They weren't meant to sort of be real. They were meant to be conceptual, and so that you could sort of look at edge-like behaviors in the context of a hierarchy and hierarchical-like behaviors in the context of an edge. And so it's that middle area that I think, practically speaking, is the most interesting. So I was just sort of contrasting those dimensions as opposed to sort of saying that hierarchies actually truly function that way, per se.
Okay, we have about 18 minutes left. So Ben and then Mike.
The question for Linton Wells, you mentioned that you were in touch with 40,000 businesses offered to help with FEMA following a disaster. What efforts are being undertaken to look at what scenarios you can potentially prevent a disaster from occurring in the first place? For example, ensuring that flooding doesn't hit a city through developing the adequate infrastructure, and maybe the businesses, from small to large businesses, can help facilitate discussions, develop a vision, from urban planning to just general preparedness, to prevent or severely mitigate a disaster from occurring. So what sort of pre-disaster efforts are you probably looking at in that sphere?
Well, actually, I think Dave can answer better than I can, because I think FEMA actually has well-defined protection and mitigation phases in the work that they do. I mean, one of the things we've been trying to look at within, remember, I'm from defense, and so to some extent, we're not really in the civil preparedness mission in that sense, but certainly. In terms of building levees around cities and things like that outside the Corps of Engineers. But I think my sense is I was part of a conference about 2 years ago out in Philippines, in West Island, and they were looking at engineering for resilience. And the question was, how can we look at expected climate change over the next several years? How can we look at how that's going to change typhoon tracks? How can we look at which hydroelectric plants are going to now be in rain shadows and things like that? And they went around Asia and found a number of countries, looking at how different countries did it. And Taiwan, at least at this point, appeared to have a very well-structured process that began with the community, and it began with the neighborhood. In the neighborhood, people learn how to use fire extinguishers and jaws of life and things like that. And when the neighborhood gets certified, it then qualifies for, say, city-level aid or something like that. And then when the city gets a certain number of neighborhoods certified, it qualifies for province level and so on and so forth. And that bottom-up way, they actually try to build resilience and preparation into the population at all sorts of levels. And that was thought to be a very good way of doing it. The other thing, of course, is when we were this conference had happened both Haiti and Chile earthquakes that occurred. And the Philippines looked around and said, in terms of enforcement of building codes, frankly, we're closer to Haiti than we are to Chile. So what can we do about just following up on the things that we know ought to be in place? So I think it's that kind of thing that we're trying to educate people about, rather than us in our role at NDU trying to go out and enforce any sort of standards. But let me turn it over to.
No, I think you hit a lot of the key points. So this past year, 2011, was a record year. 12 $1 billion disasters in the United States, a record number of major disaster declarations, 99, most ever, surpassing the previous year, which was also a record number for the most ever. But for me, one of the most interesting ones is the disaster, the major catastrophe that didn't happen, right? Because we had record levels of water on the Mississippi, and yet through a long series of mitigation projects that were undertaken with tremendous role played by the Army Corps of Engineers, those water levels were managed. They were not without impact, but the mitigative steps that were taken over time were put into practice and worked, and we did not have a major catastrophe in the context of flooding in the way that we could have had those actions not been taken. So there are a lot of steps that go in place. Every state maintains a hazard mitigation plan. There are incentive mechanisms that are put in place with respect to how we give out disaster relief assistance post-disaster and what portion of those funds can be used to support mitigation actions outside the disaster area. Lots of different tools and pieces of the process that are involved in that we're actively supportive of and promulgating. And the last point I would say is, again, coming back to Presidential Directive 8, calls for national frameworks to be put in place for each of the key mission areas, of which one is mitigation. So it's prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. Right now there is one in place which is undergoing revision for response. We just released one for recovery, and now we're in the process of developing for the first time a national framework for mitigation in addition to the other areas. So,
Mike, and then I think Bob has his hand up. Is there anybody who hasn't asked questions yet that wants to chime in? I want to encourage.
I sent you 3 Twitter questions, if you want to check that.
Why don't you please go ahead and read them, and we'll go there. We'll start with Mike, and then we'll go to that.
Thank you. I have a quick comment which is related to a question. Following up this gentleman's point on accuracy, having drafted far too many press guidances in the State Department during terrorist incidents, it seems to me that the situation is much more complicated now with social media. The San Diego exercise you referred to, I mean, information was just flooding in, and the question is how government officials can deal with this quickly, sort out the accuracy in order to maintain credibility. Related to this, for Mr. Kaufman, with the 2 major earthquakes in Japan and New Zealand, did you all get after-action reports? Were there any lessons to be learned from those 2 countries, which are pretty wired in, and say contrast perhaps to Turkey, which is not so wired?
The short answer is yes. I mean, we've had teams in place and shared information on lessons learned, and as well as drawn on independent analysis of both those events. As to the degree of wired-inness, if you will, that was not my most articulate. I'm not personally in a position to comment. I don't have any insight to offer on that, except to say that I think that's a good question and one that we can go back and look at. But I will tell you that there are a lot of insights that we've been drawing on in other contexts in my own work, looking at the policy challenges associated with supporting community resilience and the levers that are available to us to advance that. We've been looking extensively at the experiences in Christchurch and hope to look more extensively at that, as well as in Japan. We've been doing that in conjunction with looking at the floods and the fires in Australia, experiences in the UK and in other places as well. But there is, I would raise the guts of your question up a level and say, we have a tremendous amount to learn from experiences globally in this mission space, regardless of who the we is. I say that as a representative of the U.S. government, but I think that applies across the board. There are differences in how disaster management is undertaken, who the actors are, how they engage, what the tools and approaches are, and those differences exist for a whole lot of reasons, but that does not inhibit the learning opportunity that's there. We have a lot to learn about how large-scale NGO operations interface with government, from major catastrophes overseas that can give us insight into how we can draw upon greater capabilities domestically. Similarly, in the context of how we draw in international support, search and rescue capability in the case of the New Madrid example that we talked about earlier, et cetera. So there's a lot of opportunity space there. And we are doing a lot to learn. We are not doing nearly enough. We could always do more.
Leah?
Okay, we have a question from the Twitter sphere. How are agencies and labs starting to manage social media and network data that they're harvesting, and are they looking at new spatial data infrastructures?
I think there's a lot of work being done in converting two-dimensional data or converting point data to geospatial. And in particular, if you look at the use of imagery in disaster relief, the increased attention paid to metadata, so that the images can be repurposed for purposes they hadn't been necessarily intended for. So you publish a photograph, it's got the metadata with it. You can now put it down as an overlay, KML overlay in Google Earth. People can put OpenStreetMap. They can put various kinds of show where the wells and the water requests and the flooding is. So I think that's one area that we're clearly seeing a lot more of, is the use of metadata and geospatial representations of information that comes in from other sources.
I want to stay on this just for a moment and look at the issue of social network analysis and where we're seeing an advance of social network analysis in our society, within the government, within different departments. And Mike, I'm wondering if you might be willing to say a little bit about this, because you were leading a program in which this was a priority. Where are we succeeding with social network analysis, and where are we getting blocked with it?
Okay, so I'll take a stab at this. I don't think I can answer the direct question, Mike, which is what is the current state of the art and what's being done well and what's not being done well. The project that Mike refers to is one that I launched at the Science and Technology Directorate at DHS, and it's one that I still think is out there that needs to be adopted, and that is that most of the social network analysis efforts that have been pursued at this point have been focused on identifying the structures of existing networks, terrorist networks specifically, money laundering networks, drug trade, disease flow, transmission, those kinds of things. So it's a problem that we recognize. We want to understand what the network for the transmission of this particular initiative is. One of the things that I think we really need to focus effort on is trying to identify how to develop or how to design and then develop optimal networks to solve specific problems. And the one that I was interested in at DHS was, so we map a social network in a community as a baseline of information prior to a disaster, and then we use that information then to restructure the society and to bring the society and the community itself back afterwards, taking into account what the economic structure was for the community before it had been impacted by a disaster, how that could be restructured in an optimal fashion afterwards, and then the community reconstituted both culturally and both and as regards the population and its geophysical terrain in the neighborhoods, but also as a cultural entity. So we don't lose the cohesion of the culture like we did in New Orleans immediately after Katrina, where it was basically dissected and dispersed across the entire nation, with limited ability for some of those communities to reconstitute. So that's one area. Another area, and I know having just done some work with the American Red Cross that they're very interested in, which I think is a real growing area of opportunity, is to develop a methodology for us to map the networks themselves in the local communities as baseline information. That can be done to a certain extent right now, but it's by and large done by very large-scale computing systems that I think can be, and I know they can be because I had a number of companies that were interested in doing this work, miniaturize those capabilities to like an 85% fidelity rather than 100% fidelity, put them in a laptop, and give them to an emergency operations center in any given community with probably not much more complexity than is required of somebody to run the GIS mapping system at a local EOC.
Yeah.
I mean, any associate graduate from a community college can do that. That's who gets hired to do those things in EOCs by and large. We could easily, I think, build systems that would enable communities to map themselves.
Yes.
And then as a result of that mapping process at the cultural level, integrate that in with our geophysical maps of terrain and critical infrastructures, and understand what the relationship is between affected populations and vulnerable populations, hazard and risk zones that are at the high level within a community, and then to do optimize the planning that we are by and large doing right now based on traffic flows and communication systems and those kind of things. So
Great.
2 areas right there that I think we can put some
Thank
real
you.
effort.
So there's 2 more questions here, Bob and then Louise. And oh, you're going to scratch. But Bob, let me ask you a quick question then. In terms of the adaptability of a system that can lower the fear of a population, and the possibility that in the process of lowering the fear in regards to a certain crisis, that the population may become less adaptive to problems that could lead to a collapse in social ecology. Do you want to make any quick comment on that? We only have about 4 or 5 more minutes, and I want to get Louise's question in too.
Well, as you and I have discussed a number of times, my view is that one of the primary jobs for the person in charge of a response, recognizing that it's a unity of effort thing rather than a unity of command thing, because there's lots of players that don't necessarily answer to the person who is, quote, in charge, unquote. One of the key responsibilities for that person is to lower the fear factor in the affected population, that the situation is understood and is going to be dealt with in a proper manner. I think there's a difference between saying the situation will be dealt with and we're going to handle it for you. I think you can encourage multiple levels of response, starting at the individual and family level, and nonprofit NGOs, for-profit NGOs, government, and the neighborhood kind of levels of response. By encouraging each of them to behave in the ways that they need to, and by providing a framework in which they can operate and be successful, rather than we're going to be the nanny state taking care of you. And it's a question of being a leader as opposed to being a babysitter kind of a thing.
Great, thank you. Louise, we're running, first from Twitter Sphere, or?
No, once
Okay.
he's done, I'll ask.
Okay.
Yeah, this connects with David and what this gentleman just said. I believe that we have failures analytically because we are analyzing stovepipes. We're not looking at the bigger picture. If you look at 2010, there were floods in Australia bigger in size than Germany and France combined. There were floods in Pakistan. There were droughts both in France and in Germany. There were fires in Canada and in Brazil. So overall, when you look at that big picture, there was no enough wheat to feed the world. Price goes up because of the demand, and you start having conflicts all over the world. If you go to each of these scenarios, that's usually what comes out from analytics. And people were blaming Russia. People were, but that failure of looking at the bigger picture, I think it's my main concern.
Okay, as you go into the question, I want to put out to the folks in the Twitter sphere and the forums and so on, please tell us how this went for you. It's important for us to understand how we can do it better.
I was going to say, could you put up that slide where you had all the contact information, your email, and a slide for the Resilience Forum if you want people to get involved? And then since the Woodrow Wilson Center is a policy think tank, my question is going to be, going forward, what policy recommendations might you have for government, both at the federal level and at the local level, to enable these resilient networks?
So I'll start. Since you asked about policy recommendations for government, I think one of the things that we don't pay nearly enough attention to, excuse me, is not so much how we execute specific programs or employ different authorities that are available to us, but rather how we set conditions overall. And that's the space where there's the most opportunity. We really need to step back and think about how we set the conditions that allow for and support emergence and integration of resources from different avenues. And that requires something, sometimes just simply asking. In some of the major flooding in Australia, if you go on YouTube, you can run a search for the Mud Army. And my understanding of that is that was elicited, that was a 60,000 person volunteer response to flooding in a major metropolitan area that was elicited when government asked for help and opened the door, set the conditions that allowed for that emergence. How many other contexts can we do that in? We will be surprised at what sort of resources and capabilities exist if we allow for them to come forward and engage with them in a cooperative fashion to some outcome.
I would like to enshrine concepts of agility within policy, and I think that informed policy could benefit by an identification of what are the impediments in existing policy that prevent people from acting in what we would consider reasonable ways to be more flexible, more adaptive, and so forth.
So just to put some specificity on exactly those 2 points, I think the issue of public-private cooperation, both in setting conditions and being more agile, is an area where well-meaning people are consistently tripping over problems, and I think a concerted effort to try to make it easier for the two groups to work together would be a major opportunity.
I want to shoot the moon on this particular question. I'd like to ask that for the development of a national sustainable security infrastructure initiative that sits as an umbrella over all existing systems, that has agility within its capability and mandate, but to deal with the issues that all of the other departments can't face successfully. There are many issues now that require governance and probably require whole society governance, that it's not in this person's bureaucracy or that person's avenue to address it. Well, who's going to take care of it? If we have these strategic challenges coming at us, we better have a national sustainable security infrastructure to deal with it. And within that, I would ask that there be a civil society-driven public-private consortium that isn't constrained by the rules. It can use the best science, technology, management, and governance at its own speed to deal with the issues independent of acquisition cycles, and that we have that kind of capability not just for the downside issues, but also for our national competitiveness going forward. Thank you so much. This has really been a fun discourse. I want to mention that we will have another session of this series on social media and governance in times of transition at the National Defense University. We'll communicate with you about the date. It's going to be sometime in spring. Also, NAPA, the National Academy of Public Administration, has an interest also in having a session, so there'll probably be another one. But both of those would lead toward a U.S. Resilience Summit in the fall, is what we're proposing, where we'd come all together and we would run a simulation and test how agile you really are under circumstances that are impending, let's say. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your contributions and you being with us here today.